asking this: why hasn't Keir Starmer condemned Alaa Abd El Fattah's anti-Semitic, anti-British and openly racist tweets?
At 8 p.m, 13.9 million users erupted in outrage on the X platform as Prime Minister Starmer enthusiastically welcomed Alaa Abd El Fattah back to Britain, a radical terrorist linked to the 2021 White murder plot. Within hours, over 90,000 protesters had poured across England, spreading to Birmingham and Manchester. Alarms blared throughout Westminster as riot barriers were erected and crowds chanted angry slogans. The slogans, "Deport now" or "Resign," echoed throughout Whitehall. By 8:35 p.m, the reaction had erupted online and in the streets. Hashtags calling for action had surpassed 1.6 million interactions in less than 2 hours. Crowds gathered outside Parliament House, while protests spread to Leeds and Birmingham. Police reported over 12,000 calls to protest circulating online in real time. Alaa Abd El Fattah's tweets, which had previously outraged the nation, included, "Don't worry, we were only discussing how we'll take over your town and rape your women. Us terrorists tend to do that," was just one of his disgusting statements. Outside, chants of "Not in our name" echoed throughout Whitehall as anger mounted. What began as anger transformed into mass mobilisation, and the atmosphere across England shifted from protest to confrontation. But before we break down who this man really is and what Starmer's decision means, it's worth asking why so much of the mainstream media is downplaying the seriousness of what's happening. That's exactly why we created UK Instability, to cut through the noise and tell the stories others won't.
It happened faster than anyone expected and louder than anyone could control. A single decision framed as routine diplomacy detonated into one of the most volatile political nights Westminster has faced in years. The Prime Minister's public welcome of Alaa Abd El Fattah was meant to signal values, confidence, leadership. Instead, it landed like a dropped match in dry grass. Within minutes, outrage spread online. Within hours, it spilled onto the streets. What followed was not one protest, not one argument, not one political disagreement, but a chain reaction that exposed fault lines running straight through public trust, government transparency, and national stability. To understand how this spiraled so quickly, we need to break down the 10 moments that turned a political gesture into a full-scale crisis. The first rupture came not from policy papers or parliamentary debate, but from optics. The Prime Minister's visible enthusiasm in welcoming Alaa Abd El Fattah set the tone before a single explanation was offered. There was no measured framing, no contextual briefing, no immediate acknowledgement of the controversy surrounding Abd El Fattah's past statements. In politics, perception is often as powerful as action, and this moment created a perception of celebration rather than caution. For many watching, it appeared abrupt, unilateral, and disconnected from public sentiment. The absence of early clarification allowed suspicion to flourish. Instead of shaping the narrative, the government surrendered control of it, leaving space for anger to grow unchecked. The reaction was immediate because the moment felt final, not consultative, and once that impression formed, it became extremely difficult to reverse. And when clarity is missing, the internet fills the gap at frightening speed. Online reactions surged with remarkable velocity. Social platforms became forensic zones where archived posts, screenshots, and historical statements attributed to Abd El Fattah resurfaced en masse. The sheer volume of material circulating overwhelmed any attempt at moderation or context. What mattered was not chronology or nuance, but tone. Many of the resurfaced remarks were perceived as hostile, provocative, or inflammatory, reigniting older controversies that large portions of the public had never seen before. This digital excavation created the impression that vital information had been concealed. Whether accurate or not, that belief hardened rapidly. Once millions felt they were discovering something the government had not openly addressed, outrage became self-sustaining. Online discourse moved beyond criticism into accusation, with users questioning motives, intent, and competence at the highest level. But online outrage rarely stays behind a screen. As evening approached, digital fury transformed into physical mobilization. Crowds began gathering outside government buildings, first in London, then across major cities. These were not tightly organized demonstrations, but spontaneous convergences driven by shared anger rather than coordinated leadership. The atmosphere was emotionally charged, not ideological. People arrived with phones, placards, and a sense of disbelief that hardened into defiance. Chants reflected confusion as much as fury, demanding explanations that had not yet been offered. The pace at which this mobilization unfolded caught authorities off guard. What might once have taken days now took hours. The streets became an extension of the comment section, only louder, angrier, and far harder to control. And once crowds form, the margin for error vanishes.
By 9:10 p.m, tensions boiled over. Demonstrations near Whitehall and Parliament Square turned volatile as crowds pushed against police lines. Officers in riot gear moved in while bottles and flares were thrown from the back of the crowd. Sirens cut through the noise as over 70 arrests were reported within the hour, and at least a dozen officers were injured trying to hold positions. Public transport was shut down across central London. What began as protest had now crossed into open confrontation, with anger no longer contained by chance, but spilling onto the streets in real time. By 9:40 p.m, the crisis escalated sharply when Nigel Farage broke his silence. In a public statement posted online, he confirmed he had formally written to the Home Secretary demanding that Alaa Abdel Fattah's British citizenship be revoked and that he be deported. Within minutes, the statement went viral. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Crowds outside Parliament swelled to nearly 90,000 people, with opposing groups now shouting directly at one another. Some waved union flags, others held placards accusing the government of protecting extremists. Police were forced to expand cordons as confrontations intensified along Whitehall and Downing Street. Online, Farage's statement triggered over 500,000 engagements in under an hour, becoming one of the most shared political posts of the night. Supporters praised him for saying what others wouldn't. Critics accused him of inflaming an already volatile situation. By this point, the protests were no longer just about Alaa Abdel Fattah. They had become a referendum on leadership, borders, and trust in government. Chants shifted from anger toward Alaa to direct fury at Keir Starmer himself, marking a dangerous turning point in the night's events. By 10:30 p.m, the situation had spiraled beyond control. What began as protest had turned into the most serious public disorder Britain had seen in years. Police confirmed over 90,000 people in central London, with flashpoints spreading toward Westminster Bridge, Trafalgar Square, and Whitehall. Riot units were deployed in full formation. Barriers collapsed under pressure. The sky as crowds surged forward. Emergency services reported more than 120 injuries, including over 30 police officers, some struck by thrown objects.
Security measures escalated quickly as police erected barriers around key sites in Westminster. Riot units were deployed preemptively, signaling concern about potential disorder. The presence of heavy policing altered the mood instantly. What had begun as protest started to feel like confrontation. Chants sharpened, tensions rose. The visual language of shields, helmets, and cordons communicated seriousness but also amplified frustration among demonstrators who felt unheard. This shift marked a critical psychological moment. When people believe they are being managed rather than listened to, resistance hardens. Barriers became symbols, not safeguards. Each shouted slogan echoed the growing sense that communication between government and public had broken down entirely. Then a political accelerant hit the fire. Nigel Farage's intervention acted as a catalyst that intensified division. His public demand for deportation reframed the protests overnight. Supporters interpreted his statement as overdue bluntness. Critics saw it as reckless provocation. Either way, it polarized an already volatile environment. Attendance swelled. Counter-protesters appeared. Online engagement exploded again, feeding directly back into the streets. The issue stopped being singular, it became symbolic, drawing in debates about borders, leadership, and national identity. Farage's comments did not create the anger, but they sharpened it, focusing public attention and locking opposing sides into collision rather than dialogue. From that moment, restraint became optional.
The protests deteriorated into disorder as night fell. Objects were thrown, flares ignited, police lines came under sustained pressure, arrests mounted rapidly as officers attempted to contain expanding flashpoints, public transport shut down, compounding the sense of crisis. What distinguished this phase was speed. There was no gradual escalation, only abrupt rupture. Officers reported exhaustion within hours, and emergency services struggled to navigate congested streets. This was no longer about symbolism or statements. It was about control, safety, and damage limitation. The state's authority was being tested publicly, visibly, and relentlessly. Yet the deepest shock landed inside Parliament itself. As events unfolded, it emerged that numerous MPs had not been briefed on the decision in advance. This revelation proved corrosive. Public anger redirected itself toward process rather than personality. Questions multiplied. Who approved this? Who knew? Who didn't? The perception of internal disarray undermined confidence more than any single statement could. When elected representatives appear uninformed, the public assumes incompetence or concealment. Parliamentary debate, delayed and reactive, struggled to regain credibility.
Several police vehicles were damaged and multiple storefronts were forced to shut as violence spilled into surrounding streets. Transport authorities suspended underground lines across central zones. Sirens echoed continuously as ambulances struggled to reach the injured. Live feeds showed scenes of chaos, people running, shouting, pushing against police shields. The chants had changed, no longer about Allah alone, but now directly targeting the Prime Minister. Starmer must go, echoed through the crowd. Government sources later confirmed that emergency meetings were called inside Downing Street as security officials warned the situation was approaching a critical threshold. Intelligence units flagged a sharp rise in online calls for mass action, with some posts viewed hundreds of thousands of times within minutes. By midnight, the damage was clear. Central London partially locked down, dozens arrested, public confidence shaken, a political crisis fully ignited. What began as a diplomatic decision had exploded into a national reckoning, and the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. By 11:15 p.m., the narrative surrounding the protests shifted dramatically. What had begun as anger over government decision-making now turned into a full-scale public reckoning over who Allah Abdel Fattah really was and why he had been welcomed back so publicly. Across social media, archived screenshots of Allah's past statements resurfaced at scale. Within a single hour, analysts recorded over 2.3 million views on posts compiling his old remarks. Many of them dated back more than a decade, but their tone shocked large sections of the public. Commentators highlighted language that appeared to justify violence, glorify political aggression, and express hostility towards state authorities. The reaction was immediate. By midnight, police confirmed fresh flare-ups in Manchester, Leeds, and Bristol as protesters gathered outside government buildings demanding explanations. Chants shifted again, no longer focused solely on deportation, but now on accountability. Why was this hidden? Who approved this? Who knew and said nothing? Television networks cut into regular programming as political pressure intensified. Senior figures within Parliament were forced to respond live on air. Several MPs admitted they had not been.
The sense that the decision bypassed scrutiny fed the belief that democratic norms had been sidelined. And once scrutiny collapses, trust follows. Public discourse shifted decisively toward broader grievances. Protesters increasingly framed the issue as one of priorities. Rising crime, economic strain, and public safety were repeatedly cited as neglected concerns. The welcome extended to Abdel Fattah became a lightning rod for accumulated frustration. Many argued that urgency had been selectively applied, that symbolism had trumped substance. This framing resonated across political lines. It was no longer a partisan argument, but an emotional reckoning. The most repeated question was simple and damning. Who is this government listening to? That question landed squarely at the Prime Minister's door. Pressure on the Prime Minister intensified throughout the night. Emergency meetings were convened. Calls for inquiries grew louder. Petitions gained signatures at a staggering pace. Analysts noted a sharp spike in negative sentiment across platforms. The silence from leadership during the height of unrest was interpreted by many as detachment. In crises, absence communicates as loudly as speech. By failing to address the public swiftly and directly, the government allowed speculation to dominate. The narrative hardened into one of misjudgment rather than misunderstanding. And finally, the broader meaning became impossible to ignore. By early morning, the protests had slowed, but the consequences remained. The unrest revealed a fracture deeper than one decision or one individual. It exposed a widening gap between governance and perception, authority and legitimacy. This episode became a mirror reflecting unresolved tensions across society. People were not only reacting to what happened, but to how often they felt excluded from decisions that shaped their lives. The crisis was no longer unfolding on the streets. It had moved into the national psyche, where trust, once broken, is painfully slow to repair. This story is still developing, and its impact will extend far beyond one night of unrest. The questions raised here will shape political debate in the weeks ahead. Share your views below. Was this a failure of judgment, communication, or leadership? If you value clear, unfiltered analysis as events unfold, follow BritainVoice, stay informed, and stay engaged. The conversation does not end here.